The police station was unusually quiet that night. The kind of quiet that presses in on you, making every creak of the building and rustle of papers sound unnaturally loud. Officer Sarah Morgan sat at her desk, tapping away at her report, the glow of her monitor the only illumination in the dimly lit room. It was nearing midnight, and the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. Rain battered the station's windows in relentless sheets, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the parking lot beyond. Sarah stretched, glancing over at her partner, Officer Jake Rowe, who was reclining in his chair with his feet propped up on the desk, scrolling through his phone. "Slow night," he muttered, not looking up. "Yeah, let's hope it stays that way," Sarah replied, yawning. She was only half paying attention when it started, a faint sound, almost indistinguishable from the rain at first. A soft, persistent meowing. Her brow furrowed as she looked toward the front doors of the station. "Do you hear that?" Jake didn't respond immediately, engrossed in whatever he was reading. Sarah stood up, brushing her uniform down as she walked toward the glass doors. The sound grew louder, more urgent, as she approached. A scruffy black and white cat was pressed against the door, its golden eyes wide and pleading. "What the?" Sarah opened the door slightly, and the cat darted in before she could react. It moved like a shadow, sleek and fast, weaving between her legs and into the room. "Looks like you've got yourself a new partner," Jake said with a chuckle, swiveling his chair to get a better look. "Very funny," Sarah replied, crouching down to get a closer look at the cat. It was thin, its fur matted and damp from the rain. It meowed insistently, pacing in circles before stopping to paw at her boot. Sarah frowned. This isn't normal behavior. Jake stood, stretching as he walked over. "It's just a stray, probably looking for food or shelter." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The cat's meows weren't random. They seemed directed, urgent. As she reached out to touch it, her fingers brushed against something damp. Pulling her hand back, she saw a faint smear of blood. "Jake," she said sharply, "this cat has blood on it." Jake's easygoing demeanor shifted as he leaned down for a closer look. The cat didn't seem injured, but its paws and fur were flecked with what unmistakably looked like blood. "Okay, now that's weird." The cat let out a sharp yowl, darting toward the door, stopping just short of exiting. It turned back to them, tail flicking impatiently. "Is it trying to lead us somewhere?" Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. "I don't know, but it's worth checking out," Sarah said. She grabbed her flashlight and raincoat, pulling them on quickly. Jake sighed, grabbing his gear as well. This had better not be some wild goose chase, he muttered as they followed the cat out into the storm. The night swallowed them as soon as they stepped outside, the rain immediately soaking their uniforms. The cat darted ahead, its black and white fur barely visible against the dark streets. Sarah and Jake followed as quickly as they could, their flashlights cutting through the downpour. The town was eerily quiet, the storm having driven most people indoors. Only the sound of their boots splashing through puddles and the cat's occasional meows broke the silence. The cat led them down narrow alleys, through overgrown lots, and across empty streets, never stopping, never hesitating. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. There was an intelligence behind the animal's actions, as if it knew exactly where it was going. After nearly 20 minutes of following the cat, they found themselves standing in front of an old industrial warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building loomed over them, its windows broken, its walls covered in graffiti. Rusted machinery and debris were scattered around the entrance, and the faint smell of decay wafted from within. "This place has been abandoned for years," Jake said, shining his flashlight at the entrance. "Why would it bring us here?" The cat stopped, turning to look at them one last time before disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Sarah tightened her grip on her flashlight, her pulse quickening. "I don't like this." Jake gave her a wry smile. "Since when did you start listening to cats?" "Since one of them showed up at the station covered in blood," she shot back, stepping forward cautiously. The air inside the warehouse was heavy, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew. Their flashlights illuminated a scene of chaos. Discarded crates, rusted machinery, and piles of trash littered the floor. The cat was nowhere to be seen, but the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the cavernous space. They moved deeper into the building, their boots crunching on broken glass. The atmosphere was oppressive, the silence deafening except for the occasional rumble of thunder outside. Then they saw it, a faint, dark smear on the concrete floor. Blood. Jake knelt, examining the stain. "It's fresh," he said grimly, looking up at Sarah. Her flashlight beam caught something in the corner, a tarp, partially covering what appeared to be a pile of clothes or rags. But as she stepped closer, her stomach dropped. It wasn't clothes. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We got a body." Jake was by her side in an instant, his flashlight revealing more details. The victim, a middle-aged man, was sprawled out on the ground, his hands bound with rough rope. His face was contorted in terror, and strange, jagged symbols were carved into his arms and chest. Sarah felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat, but she forced herself to stay focused. This isn't random." Before Jake could respond, a low growl echoed through the space. They turned, their flashlights darting around the room, but saw nothing. Then, out of the shadows, the cat reappeared. Its fur bristled, and its tail stood on end as it stared at a set of stairs leading down to the basement. Jake swallowed hard. "You've got to be kidding me." Sarah met his gaze. "We didn't come this far to stop now." They exchanged a tense nod, their flashlights illuminating the narrow stairwell as they descended into the darkness below. The air grew colder and heavier as they descended the narrow stairwell into the basement. The creaking of the old wooden stairs echoed through the cavernous warehouse, mingling with the faint dripping of water that seemed to come from somewhere deep below. The dim light from their flashlights barely penetrated the oppressive darkness that awaited them, revealing only glimpses of damp concrete walls and cobweb-draped corners. Sarah led the way, her heart pounding as she tried to steady her breathing. She glanced back at Jake, whose jaw was clenched, his flashlight sweeping methodically across the walls. Neither of them spoke. The silence was too thick, too suffocating, and neither wanted to break it. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, their flashlights illuminated a low, arched doorway with a rusted iron door hanging slightly ajar. The faint smell of mildew was stronger here, but underneath it was another odor, something metallic and sharp. Blood. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her holstered weapon. Jake caught her eye and nodded, signaling for her to proceed carefully. She pushed the door open with the toe of her boot, the hinges groaning loudly in protest. The room beyond was small, damp, and suffused with an eerie, flickering glow. A cluster of candles burned on the far side, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the center of the room, arranged in a crude circle, was a disturbing collection of objects. A knife with a serrated blade, its edge stained dark, a small animal skull, polished and gleaming in the candlelight, and a set of crude symbols scrawled in what looked like dried blood. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped inside. Jake followed, his flashlight beam scanning the makeshift altar and the symbols on the floor. "This is twisted," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah knelt to get a closer look at the symbols. They were jagged, almost runic, and they seemed familiar. She had seen something similar before, years ago, during a training seminar on occult-related crimes. But these weren't identical. They were cruder, hastier, as if drawn by someone imitating what they had seen. "This isn't just twisted," Sarah said, her voice tight. "It's deliberate. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Jake's flashlight beam moved to the far corner of the room, and his breath caught. "Sarah." She turned, following his light. In the corner, barely visible in the flickering glow of the candles, was a small, makeshift cage. Inside, huddled and trembling, was a young woman. Her wrists and ankles were bound with fraying rope, and her mouth was gagged with a dirty strip of fabric. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto theirs. "Holy!" Sarah rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the cage. "It's okay," she said gently, trying to calm the woman. "We're here to help." Jake knelt beside her, examining the lock on the cage. It was old and rusted, but sturdy. "We're going to need tools to get this open," he said, glancing at Sarah. The woman shook her head frantically, her muffled cries growing louder. She was trying to tell them something, but the gag made her words incomprehensible. Sarah reached through the bars to loosen the fabric, but the woman recoiled, her eyes darting toward the doorway. "Wait," Sarah said, freezing. "She's not afraid of us." Jake's flashlight swung toward the doorway just as a heavy thud echoed through the basement. Footsteps, deliberate, slow, and unnervingly calm, descended the stairs. "Someone's coming," Jake hissed, rising to his feet and drawing his weapon. Sarah did the same, her heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the shadows in the stairwell shifted as the intruder approached. Sarah backed toward the cage, positioning herself between the woman and the doorway. Jake took a step forward, his weapon trained on the opening. The figure emerged, tall and cloaked in a hooded jacket. The shadows obscured their face, but the glint of a knife in their hand was unmistakable. The person stopped just inside the doorway, their head tilting slightly as if studying the officers. "Police!" Jake barked, his voice firm. "Drop the weapon and put your hands where I can see them." The intruder didn't respond. Instead, they took a slow, deliberate step forward, the blade catching the flickering candlelight. Sarah's grip on her weapon tightened as she steadied her aim. "I said drop it," Jake repeated, his tone sharper this time. The figure stopped, tilting their head again, before suddenly spinning and darting back up the stairs with alarming speed. "Damn it!" Jake cursed, bolting after them. "Jake, wait!" Sarah called, but it was too late. He was already halfway up the stairs. She turned back to the woman in the cage. "I'll be back for you, I promise," she said quickly, before following Jake up the steps. Her boots pounded against the wooden stairs as she ascended, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly with each step. The storm outside seemed louder now, the sound of rain hammering against the building mingling with the pounding of her heart. When she reached the main floor, Jake was standing near the warehouse entrance, his weapon lowered. "Where is he?" Sarah asked, breathless. "Gone," Jake said, his jaw tight. "He must have known this place better than we do. Slipped out one of the side exits." Sarah cursed under her breath. "We need to secure this scene. Call it in. And we need to get that woman out of there before he comes back." Jake nodded, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 5. We need immediate backup at the old warehouse on East Pine. We got a possible homicide and a hostage. Suspect fled the scene, heading east." "Over." As Jake relayed their location, Sarah turned back toward the basement stairs. A faint noise caught her attention, a low, guttural growl. She froze, her flashlight beam sweeping across the shadows. The cat was back, sitting on a rusted crate near the stairwell. Its fur bristled, and its tail flicked sharply as it stared at her. The growl rumbled from its throat, low and menacing. "What now?" Jake asked, noticing her hesitation. Sarah pointed at the cat. "It's been leading us this whole time. I think it's warning us." Jake frowned. "Warning us about what?" Before she could answer, another sound reached them, a faint, rhythmic creaking coming from deeper within the warehouse. Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. It was the sound of something swinging or swaying, like a door or a piece of machinery moving in the wind. Except there was no wind inside the warehouse. "Stay close," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She moved cautiously toward the sound, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Jake followed, his weapon still drawn. As they rounded a corner, the source of the noise became clear. A large metal hook, suspended from the ceiling by a rusted chain, swung gently back and forth. Beneath it was another tarp, identical to the one they had found earlier. Sarah's stomach churned as she stepped closer, peeling back the edge of the tarp with the tip of her boot. Beneath it was another body, this one smaller and even more gruesomely mutilated than the first. Jake let out a low curse. "This is a goddamn slaughterhouse." The cat let out a sharp yowl, drawing their attention back to the basement stairs. It was sitting at the top, its eyes glowing in the dim light as it stared at them. Sarah felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. "We're not dealing with just one victim," she said quietly. "This place, it's a killing ground." Jake adjusted his grip on his flashlight, his knuckles white against the handle of his weapon. Sarah's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. This place, it's a killing ground. The oppressive realization set in as they stood amidst the macabre remnants of what could only be described as ritualistic horror. Every instinct screamed at Sarah to retreat, to wait for backup, but something about the situation gnawed at her, a gut feeling she couldn't shake. They were running out of time. The cat, perched at the top of the basement stairs, let out another insistent yowl. Its golden eyes locked onto Sarah's, almost as if urging her to hurry. Jake noticed it too, his frown deepening. "Do you get the feeling this cat knows more than it should?" he muttered, his voice low. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped toward the stairs, her flashlight beam cutting through the dim, stale air. The cat bolted down into the darkness, its tail disappearing from view. Sarah glanced at Jake. "We have to go back down. There's something we missed." Jake groaned but nodded, his boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor as he followed her. The creaking of the stairs seemed louder this time, each step an ominous prelude to what awaited them below. As they descended, Sarah's thoughts raced. The woman they'd found in the cage was clearly terrified, not just of her captor, but of something else, something she hadn't been able to communicate. Was there more to this situation than a lone perpetrator? The evidence they had seen so far suggested something far darker than a simple series of crimes. Sarah's pulse quickened at the thought. When they reached the basement again, the flickering candlelight seemed even dimmer, the shadows thicker. The woman in the cage was still there, her eyes wide with panic as she struggled against her bindings. She whimpered as they approached, shaking her head frantically. "She's scared out of her mind," Jake said, lowering his weapon and crouching near the cage. "We need to get her out of here." Sarah knelt beside him, carefully removing the gag from the woman's mouth. The woman gasped for air, her voice hoarse and trembling. "He's coming back," she rasped. "He's not alone." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Who? Who's coming back?" The woman shook her head violently. "You don't understand. He's not human. None of them are." Jake exchanged a glance with Sarah, his expression skeptical. "She's in shock," he whispered. "Probably been through hell. We can't take everything she says at face value." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The woman's terror was too visceral, too raw. "How many?" Sarah pressed gently. "How many are there?" The woman's lips trembled as she whispered, "3. They'll kill you. They'll kill all of us." Before Sarah could ask more, the cat let out a guttural growl, low and menacing. Both officers turned their flashlights toward the stairs, just in time to catch a shadow moving across the doorway above. Jake sprang to his feet, weapon drawn. "We got company." Sarah followed, her heart pounding as the sound of footsteps echoed through the basement. Unlike before, these footsteps were hurried, accompanied by the metallic clatter of something being dragged. The woman in the cage screamed, her voice piercing the oppressive silence. "Stay here," Sarah instructed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She gestured for Jake to cover her as she moved toward the stairs, her flashlight darting across the darkness. Halfway up, the cat streaked past her, its fur bristling and its growl deepening. Sarah's flashlight caught a fleeting glimpse of the intruder, a tall figure shrouded in a tattered cloak, its face obscured by a crude mask. In its hands, it clutched a long, rusted chain that clinked with each step. "Freeze!" Sarah shouted, her voice firm. "Police! Drop the weapon and put your hands where I can see them." The figure paused at the top of the stairs, tilting its head in a gesture eerily similar to the first intruder. Then, without warning, it turned and bolted deeper into the warehouse. "Go!" Jake yelled, racing past Sarah and up the stairs. She followed, her flashlight slicing through the shadows as they pursued the figure through the maze of the warehouse. The storm outside raged on, the thunder and lightning casting intermittent flashes of light through the broken windows. The figure was fast, weaving through the debris with an agility that seemed almost unnatural. Jake cursed under his breath, struggling to keep up. How was he moving like that? Sarah didn't have an answer. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself to keep pace, her mind racing with questions. Who were these people? What was their purpose here? And why did it feel like they were being led into a trap? The pursuit came to an abrupt halt when the figure disappeared into a large, rusted ventilation shaft. Jake stopped short, his flashlight beam revealing the gaping hole in the wall. Damn it, he's gone. Sarah caught up, her chest heaving as she scanned the area. The cat appeared again, circling her legs and meowing loudly. It pawed at the ground near the shaft, its claws scraping against the concrete. "What is it, boy?" Sarah asked, kneeling to get a closer look. Her flashlight revealed scratches in the concrete, as if something heavy had been dragged through the opening. Jake shook his head. "We can't follow him in there. It's too dangerous." Sarah reluctantly agreed, standing and glancing around. The storm continued to rage outside, and the oppressive atmosphere of the warehouse seemed to press in on them even more. "We need to secure the woman and call for reinforcements. This is bigger than us." Jake nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed. Let's get back to her." As they made their way back to the basement, Sarah's thoughts churned. The symbols, the altar, the mutilated bodies. All of it pointed to something far darker than they had initially imagined. And the woman's warning echoed in her mind. They're not human. When they reached the basement, they found the cage empty. The woman was gone. Jake froze, his flashlight beam darting around the room. What the hell? She was right here. Sarah's blood ran cold. The ropes that had bound the woman were lying on the floor, frayed and torn, as if she had been forcibly removed. The cat let out a sharp hiss, its fur standing on end as it stared at the far corner of the room. Then they heard it, a low, guttural growl that didn't come from the cat. It resonated through the basement, sending a chill down their spines. Sarah and Jake turned their flashlights toward the corner, their weapons raised. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at them from the darkness. The glow of the eyes from the corner of the room was like two burning coals, piercing through the suffocating darkness. Sarah's flashlight beam wavered as her hands trembled, but she forced herself to steady it. The air in the basement had shifted, thicker, colder, and laced with a palpable sense of danger. Jake stepped closer to her, his weapon raised, his breathing shallow. "What is that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure in the corner was partially obscured by shadows, but its outline was unmistakable, tall, unnaturally thin, and hunched. The faint sound of wet, guttural breathing emanated from it, accompanied by the subtle scraping of claws against concrete. The cat arched its back, its fur bristling as it hissed at the figure. It took a step forward, positioning itself between the officers and the entity. Sarah couldn't believe it. This stray, half-starved cat was standing its ground against something that made every instinct in her scream to run. "Step out where we can see you," Sarah commanded, her voice firm despite the knot of fear tightening in her chest. The figure didn't move, but its breathing grew louder, more erratic, as if it were savoring the tension in the room. Then, with a sudden, inhuman speed, it lunged forward, stopping just short of the edge of the flashlight's beam. Sarah gasped. The thing wasn't human. Its face, or what passed for one, was a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and bone, with gnarled, jagged teeth protruding from a misshapen mouth. Its eyes glowed unnaturally, almost hypnotically, and its limbs were unnervingly long and spindly, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers. "Holy!" Jake started, but his words were cut off as the creature let out a bone-chilling screech. It echoed off the walls, the sound so unnatural it made Sarah's knees go weak. The creature began to move, circling the edge of the room just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. It was fast, so fast that it seemed to blur as it darted between the shadows. The cat hissed again, yowling loudly, its voice echoing defiantly in the oppressive silence. Jake fired a shot. The muzzle flash lit up the room for a split second, and the bullet struck the wall where the creature had been a moment earlier. It had moved before the shot even landed. "Damn it!" Jake cursed, stepping back towards Sarah. "What the hell are we dealing with?" The creature stopped abruptly, crouching low. Sarah's flashlight caught a glimpse of its grotesque form as it seemed to assess them. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it bolted, disappearing up the stairs in a blur of motion. The sound of its claws scraping against the concrete steps sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "Do we go after it?" Jake asked, his voice wavering for the first time. "No," Sarah said firmly. "Not yet. We need to secure this room and figure out what we're up against. That thing, whatever it is, doesn't want us here. It's trying to scare us off." Jake nodded reluctantly, his flashlight beams sweeping the room. The altar was still intact, but something had changed. The symbols on the floor, which had been scrawled in dried blood, now seemed to glisten as if freshly drawn. The air felt charged, almost electric, and the candles flickered wildly despite the lack of a breeze. Sarah's eyes landed on the torn ropes where the woman had been. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. "The woman," she said, her voice urgent. "What if it took her?" Jake shook his head. "No way. She wasn't bound tight enough for that thing to carry her off without a struggle. She got out on her own, but why would she leave without us?" Sarah countered. She was terrified. She begged us for help. Jake didn't have an answer. The cat let out a soft meow, drawing their attention back to it. It had moved to the far side of the room, sitting near a narrow opening in the wall, a small tunnel that led deeper into the underground. Sarah's heart sank. "You gotta be kidding me?" Jake sighed heavily. "There's no way that thing came from here. This is something else." The cat meowed again, pawing at the edge of the tunnel. Sarah knelt to inspect it, shining her flashlight inside. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and it stretched into darkness. She could feel the cold air wafting from it, carrying with it the faint stench of decay. "We can't go in there," Jake said, his voice firm. "It's too dangerous. Backup will be here soon." "We wait." Sarah hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to follow the tunnel, to see where it led. But Jake was right. The two of them alone wouldn't stand a chance if something happened. A sudden, loud crash from above startled them both. It sounded like something heavy had been thrown across the main floor of the warehouse. The noise was followed by a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the building. "It's back," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake raised his weapon. "We hold our ground. Whatever that thing is, it's not getting us down here." The cat darted toward the stairs, stopping halfway up and looking back at them. It let out a sharp yowl, its tail flicking impatiently. "It wants us to follow," Sarah said, her pulse quickening. Jake hesitated, his jaw tightening. "This is insane." "We don't have a choice," Sarah said. "If we stay here, we're sitting ducks." Reluctantly, Jake nodded, and the two of them moved toward the stairs, their flashlights illuminating the path ahead. The storm outside was louder now, the wind howling through the broken windows and rattling the walls. As they reached the top of the stairs, they found the main floor in disarray. Machinery had been overturned, crates smashed, and the tarp that had covered the second body was now torn to shreds. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but the sense of being watched was almost overwhelming. Sarah's eyes scanned the room, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. "Stay sharp," she whispered. Then she saw it, the woman they had found in the cage, standing near the far wall. Her back was to them, and she was completely still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Ma'am," Sarah called, stepping closer. "It's us. We're here to help." The woman didn't respond. As Sarah and Jake approached, the cat let out a low growl, its fur bristling. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her flashlight beam steady on the woman. "Something's wrong," she said quietly. The woman turned slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her eyes were vacant, her face pale and expressionless. In her hands, she held the same rusted chain they had seen the masked figure carrying earlier. Jake took a step back, his weapon raised. "What the hell is this?" The woman smiled, a chilling, unnatural smile that sent a wave of dread crashing over Sarah. Then she spoke, her voice layered with something guttural and inhuman. "You shouldn't have come here." The lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness.